Welcome to Tea, Toast, and Theology, All Things Nourishing, a podcast by The Table. Find us on the web at the-table.church.
So the backstory is that Jews and Samaritans hated each other. So this story would have had a lot more impact. It isn't just a nice guy walking by. It's an enemy of your people walking by that chose to help you when two people who not only were of your people, but were leaders in your people, a Levite and a priest, said basically thoughts and prayers and kept right going.
And building on that, I think on Friday we talked a lot about the different context that helps to kind of explain this story. Because we know this story, we know the Good Samaritan, but we talked about how the Jews and the Samaritans, even though they didn't like each other, they weren't that different from each other. That it was more like different types of apples rather than apples and oranges. And someone had brought up how 2 denarii would actually take care of the man at the inn for about 2 months. So it was not a small amount. And Father, you had started with the explaining to us the word synagogue, that it really just means gathering place, that it didn't necessarily come from a religious place of worship. And I think those all kind of help to give some context to the story.
You're thinking.
So the coming together of Jews and Gentiles, in the reading that I did on Colossians, that's exactly what that community was. It was a combination of Gentiles and Jews all coming together and realizing that Christ Jesus was the Son of God.
Feel free to say whatever.
Just to go back again to the other reading, what I was kind of thinking is that reading was really about no-be-do, because Jesus explained the parable, and then he wanted them to become more like disciples, and then he told them exactly what to do, go out and do likewise. And it just kind of struck me that followed that whole format of no-be-do.
So I read this Friday evening, and we talked about it, obviously, so I have a little prior knowledge. But the part of when he says, who will be my neighbor? Like, how will I know who my neighbor is, kind of thing, stood out to me because isn't everyone our neighbor, right? Doesn't Christ expect for us that we treat everybody as our neighbor? And I don't know that I always do that. And so it made me reflect a little bit more about my own way of handling myself. So.
I think that's I think we always think, we're the Samaritan. We're the good one. We wouldn't pass by, but we do. And that's it's human nature that, we try to stick with what's safe, what's familiar, and it takes stepping outside of ourselves to actually be the Samaritan.
Charlie, you're thinking something.
Yeah. I just don't know how to phrase it.
Okay.
I always had trouble in the beginning, and I also had trouble understanding a lot of these descriptions.
Yeah. Well, you're in good company.
One of the things that sticks out here is the penalties that points out for going against this. And it's very specific, and I think they're really sharp and accurate.
Yeah.
Here to go against them. And I'll repeat it here. It says, "Your wife shall become a prostitute in the city. Your sons and your daughters shall fall by the sword. I mean, that's a pretty steep penalty. So I just wonder why the emphasis is that there and bad. It seems really like, wow, you don't dare do it. It's pretty specific. That just sticks out in my head. The part that your wife is going to become a prostitute in the city, I mean, that's just real disaster.
It's not filtered language and even filtered thought, right? It's very unfiltered. Yeah. What else? All right, let me begin by sort of talking about the what you said, Chris, and Julie about, and Peggy about Samaritan and the Jews. It is so true that we often don't think about how, and I'm going to use the word tribal we are, right? And I'm sure you have heard it a million times before from me, in Stonington, I had this wonderful friend. His name was Ted, and he was like a teddy bear, appropriately named. And in Stonington, there used to be a lot of parties during the summer, right? And so they would talk about, okay, so like, what's the dress code, right? And he used to say, he had this thing, he used to call it the New England Tribal. And you know what the New England Tribal is? Huh?
You mean the dress code?
Yeah, New England Tribal.
Probably shorts and a polo shirt.
Well, yeah, for summer, yes. Or some kind of a blue shirt, khaki pants, and a navy blue blazer. Well, we're talking Stonington too. Right? We're talking Stonington. But you see, when he said that, I was like, that's right. Every place has a tribe. And there is a tribal code. Right? So we may think we don't have a tribe, but we actually do. That's part of human existence. We love to hang out in tribes. Right? And it can be small things, it can be big things, but we do. That's how human beings function. Actually, that's how all animals function, right? If you watch National Geographic and they talk about all these, wild animals and how they break out into their own family groups and all that, it's just what being gregarious is. Part of being gregarious is defining who the other is. Right? And here is Jesus answering that question about who is my neighbor by saying, okay, how do you define your neighbor? How do you define, in other words, how do you define your tribe? And the answer comes down to that the tribe that Jesus wants us to define ourselves around is living out God's mercy. And I want to be very specific about it. Living out God's mercy. Not about the idea of kindness that may exist in our tribe, because that's what we do often these days. We say, oh, just be kind, just be good, right? And that's sufficient. That's not what Jesus is talking about. Jesus is talking about an understanding of God's mercy that goes beyond, that goes beyond the idea of being kind. You know why I stress on it all the time? Because the idea of kindness is oftentimes defined by the tribe. Not oftentimes, it's always defined by the tribe. This is kind and this is not kind. That's why in some cultures, some things are done in some way because it's considered kind, and then since another cultures, the same thing is done in a different way because there is a different notion of kindness that is coming to play. So that doesn't work. What Jesus is saying is go with God's mercy. And that is where we find ourselves as Christians struggling. Recently, my wife had an interesting conversation with someone who said, someone dear to her, said, oh yeah, what do you do? And she said, oh, I teach Bible. You teach what? And she said, oh yeah, I teach Bible. And she said, oh my God, really? You teach Bible? And he said, yeah, I teach Bible. And she said, oh, we, for the last few years, we have been going to, I will not name the denomination, you can guess it, you all know it quite intimately, right? That I've been going to that church and all what we talk about is how to be kind. And this person said, I think I've lost my faith. Because the desire to be in the Bible and to learn the Bible and to understand the Bible, because all the time we are coming to the Bible from a tribal understanding of what is right and wrong. Right? And that is where it becomes problematic. And that is where it becomes exclusive. That is where the table starts to shrink. Right? Because we do live in a multicultural society. And it's not a present reality. That word has become in these days, right? But it's not a present reality. It has been true of the world for like millennials, right? You have had different cultures. In fact, those cultural lines were even stronger back then, right? Why? Because it was hard to communicate. Like one of the things I said on Friday was that now we live in a world where we can pick up a phone and talk to somebody across continents, right? And I shared that the first time when I had family like that, moved to Switzerland, the first thing I used to ask is, what's the time there? Right? Because the notion that you could actually both be living and talking to each other, and one would be having night and the other day, was like, wow, how could that be? Right? And then I shared this experience. She knows where I'm going. Shared this experience of someone who said, the British are 6 hours ahead of us, right? Why don't they just tell us what's going to happen? Right? You see, that whole concept is difficult because we are getting closer through communication. But the world has always been multicultural, multi-tribal, and the challenge to look beyond your own tribe has been absolutely a human challenge. And therefore, Jesus is saying, think about what it means. Now, here's where it becomes very interesting. I don't know if the people who put together the lectionary thought of all these intricacies or not. But we have a wonderful prophet, and he is known as one of the minor prophets, right? Now, there are 12 prophets who are considered minor. There are, okay, whatever. The word minor basically came from Saint Augustine of Hippo. He, for the first time, called them minor prophets, right? That was the first person who called them minor prophets. There are 12 of them, and then there are others, right? The others being Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, the people who wrote a lot, right? And then the people who didn't write a lot. And by the way, just as a refresher, the New Testament is also based on that same kind of a idea. If you go after the Gospels and the book of Acts, you know how it's arranged? The length of how much someone had to say. It's very interesting. Paul's letters are based on how long they were. The longer ones come first, and the shorter ones, you say, have them afterwards. Isn't that fun, right? You kind of like it, they all went by the length, and so did these. But here's the interesting part. This particular prophet, Amos, is considered to be, by most scholars, the first person, the first prophet who actually has his work preserved as a writing. This is to say that there were other prophets before him, obviously. How do we know that? Well, let's see. How do we know that there were other prophets before him? Oh, the person who read this reading is not here. Right? How do we know?
Does he talk about
Yes! Because he is talking about, I'm not like the other prophets. That's how we know there were other prophets that were before him, right? Well, we know through other ways too, but there were other prophets before him. And there was this prophet, Amos, who comes in, and the beautiful thing about him is that he is the first one who's writing, either he sat down himself and wrote it out, or someone wrote it for him after him. We don't know. Yeah, there's no way to know that. But we do know, obviously, that his work was preserved because we read it, right? So that's the interesting thing. But he was the very first one in the whole line of prophets whose work was preserved. And he's also the one, Charlie, whose language is the most direct. He has no filters. He goes straight for the point he's making, right? He has no filters. And here's the interesting part. Let me do a pop quiz. When you hear this story, okay, who are the people you think that this prophet is talking about or prophesying against? Come on. Not that hard a question.
the kings of
Okay.
Israel?
King of Israel, right, and not only king, but the people of Israel.
I've got a song with him this morning. My head was Elijah.
Okay, yeah, those were prophets. That's why I insisted on that hymn, right? That because that was the prophets. It's about the prophets. Yes, right. Absolutely. Any thoughts on who? Okay, let me ask you this question: Is he prophesying against the Jewish people? Charlie says, I don't think so. No? Why do you say that?
Because it says here, do not prophesy against Israel.
Well, that was what he was being told not to do.
When they tell him to go to the land of Judah, which
Yes.
is another part of the
Right.
Israelites.
All right. You'll be very happy that you were here today. Here's the thing. Jewish, the idea of Jewish comes from the land of Judah. The idea comes from the land of Judah. Okay? So remember, we are reading about it, how they came and they in 12 tribes came into this land and they started settling in, right? So there were 12 tribes. They got settled through conquering or whatever, but they got settled, right? So there were 12 tribes. And if you remember, there was, after they got settled, there were judges, and then there were kings, and then the first king was first ever king. Saul, King Saul, right? And the second one was David, right? And the third one was Solomon. And the fourth one was Solomon's son. Somebody actually had the right word. Somebody said it here. Okay, Jeroboam. Okay. All right, but I won't go to the fifth one and the sixth and the seventh, because here's the thing. Here's the thing about Israelite history that we need to pay attention to, because if we pay attention to that, a lot of what we hear will begin to make sense, even in Jesus' time. Okay? Now, I was a child, grew up in the church, and no one bothered to take the time to share with me what I'm about to share with you. Okay? All right? All on board? So all of these tribes settled there, right? And there was Judah, the land of Judah, and up there were some other land, and that land had cities such as Samaria. And there was city such as Bethel, right? These are cities which were up in the north, and in the south there was the city of Jerusalem, right? And the first king, Saul, and then David, and David became almost legendary, right? Like, for instance, right now, the house is that of, fill in the blank, you'll know all this. In England, what is the house of their royalty? Windsor. It's the house of Windsor, because someone named Windsor became so popular that his whole line is now known as the House of Windsor. Okay? Similarly, there was one king which was not Saul, even though he was the first king. The second king became so popular that that whole lineage became the house of David. Right? It became the house of David. It wasn't a physical house. It's like the house of Windsor. Right? It's the house of David. And in the house of David, there was David and there was Solomon. And Solomon, as you would know through hearing about him, became so big, right? He was entrusted. He went, remember we talked about how he would get his wood from Lebanon, right? And city of Tyre. And he would do all these things. And he had, I don't know how many hundreds of wives, because his wives came with property and some kinds of treaties, right, to make peace with other lands. And then this whole kingdom started growing, and Solomon started being known as the king who brought great glory to the people of God, right? Because he is the one who expanded everything. He brought great wealth. The golden age, right? The golden age came to that group of people. And then there were 12 tribes who were experiencing this. And when he passed, guess what? They said, who's going to be next? And 10 of those tribes said what?
We're in charge.
We're in charge. No thank you to the house of David. No thank you to the house of David. Even when they had this whole prosperity thing going under Solomon, when he passed, they refused to accept his son as their next king. And from there happened what is known as the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom ended up with 10 tribes, and the southern kingdom ended up with just 2 tribes, because that's simple math. Right? If there are 12, 10 went, how many are we left with? 2, right? So 10 went up there, and there were 2 that were left. Okay? And who were those 2? Judah, absolutely. Judah and Benjamin. Right? Judah and Benjamin were left in this southern part, and the 10 were in the northern part. And then something very interesting started happening. The northern part, so they had a conflict. They fought over who the next successor will be, and they decided we don't want it, and so there was a resolution, okay, you go form your own kingdom, we will have our own kingdom, right? So there was this and southern and northern, but obviously they were neighbors, right? Not only were they neighbors, they had the same dad. Siblings. You know what siblings do best? Yeah. Right? Right? And so every once in a while they would get into a tiff with each other. Right? And they started developing different alliances. So the South would have alliances with other nations than the ones that the North was looking to have. And so, are we clear so far? 2 siblings, 10 to Judah, and all of the ones that were over there, you see how they retained the name Israel, whereas the 2 ones got the name Judah. Isn't that interesting? Here's where the complication comes in. That when we hear the word Israel, we think of who? The people who lived in Judah. You see? That's why I went into this whole thing. Because we think Israel means, well, yes, it meant once. But then they split. And the people who retained the copyright on the word Israel were the ones who were in the north. Right? They are the ones who retained that copyright. It's important to understand this dynamics, because you'll find this really, really fun. You'll be very happy that you came today. Okay. So you have this north and south, you have 10 to, you have the copyright of Israel going to the northern part, whereas a very important symbol, because of what Solomon had done. You know Solomon's biggest achievement? I just alluded to it. He got wood from Lebanon to do what? Build the temple. And where was the temple? Jerusalem. And who had Jerusalem? Judah. Isn't that fun? Isn't that fun? Isn't that fun? You get to have the copyright to the name, but we get to keep the temple. We get to keep the temple, right? We get to keep the temple, but you get to have the name. Nice resolution in some ways. And then as they are growing and they are having different ways to deal with different people, guess what happens? This particular group in the north begins to prosper a lot. But they didn't just prosper. They prospered at the cost of the poor amongst them. That's how they prospered. Okay? Now remember, they share the same faith. They have the same father. They have the same belief. They have the same experience of Exodus. They have the same experience. Everything is the same. It's just the politics they couldn't agree on. Right? And so now, here's the fun part. This guy named Amos goes from the land of Judah over to Israel in Bethel and starts prophesying against them. Oh my God, that's problematic because politically they are different, but religiously they are aligned. So they do believe in the idea of prophecy. So they can't do a whole lot with the institution of prophets because it's a shared institution, right? But all of a sudden, this guy who has the shared access to that institution in some ways goes up there and they say, hey, hold on a second, we have our own prophets in the north. Who are you? Right? And their prophets get mad at Amos. Also because, see, how dare this southern guy come to us and tell us that we are getting it all wrong? You know, I was in Texas once for a visit. And I really wanted to have authentic Mexican food. And I was like, I'm in Texas. I should be able to find, right? I don't want Tex-Mex, right? I want authentic Mexican food. So I'm in a Uber, right? And the Uber is being driven by someone who was, I think, once from Mexico, right? So I said to him, I started a conversation with him, and I said, you know, where do I find authentic Mexican food? And he turned around and he looked at me and he said, you don't know your history, do you? And I was like, whoa, what did he just say to me? And I said, what do you mean? I'm kind of reluctant in asking them, what do you mean? He said, you are in Mexico. And I was like, whoa. You see, just imagine somebody coming from Mexico and telling Texans that they got it all wrong. For context, that's exactly what's going on here. Somebody from the South who were once all one. Right? Who were once all one. Because, yeah, the monument is still there about the fight. Remember that fight? What's that monument? Yeah. Right? Right? And I was like, oh yeah, I think I know what he's talking about. Right? And I was like, oh wow. But guess what? All of that has evolved, hasn't it? It's now called Tex-Mex. It's not Mexican anymore. Right? And that's what's going on between these kingdoms. And here comes Amos. And I'm going to take one step further and then I'm going to tie it all together. Okay? Now, in the north was the city of Samaria. Okay? And Amos goes into the north, into that kingdom from the south, and says all the very harsh things, but all very true. Because his principle is that God is not interested. If you read through, maybe for Bible study someday we will. He says, listen, God is not interested in a sense of religiosity. God is not interested who can bring the biggest sacrifice to me. God is interested, are you actually showing God's mercy to people around you? That's what he's saying. That's what Jesus is saying too in the parable, right? That's what he's saying. And he's saying, you all have failed in doing that. And the interesting thing about this prophet, which you don't find in other prophets. Most prophets tell you that you have been a bad boy or a bad girl, and then they tell you, no problem, you have a chance to repent. Right? And Amos is so mad at them that he doesn't even say you have a chance to repent. He just tells them that this is the problem with you, and because of that, all this horrible destruction is coming to you. He doesn't say, but there is a chance, right? He doesn't say to them. He says there will be a destruction. About 40 years after him, all that came to pass. It didn't happen the next day. 40 years after that, it all came to pass. And here's the fun part. Assyrians, because Judah supported Assyrians, and Assyrians came and completely annihilated the northern kingdom. Completely annihilated the northern kingdom and did all these things, took them into exile. And we call it the first exile. Right? And in that exile, are you ready? In that exile, and through that process, another line emerged. And that line was that of Samaritans. Now you see and feel the rivalry and the hatred for each other, because this dude, Amos, prophesied against the northern kingdom. North loses all of its, everything, goes, and then through that process emerges a whole new religion called Samaritans. But were they all different? No. They still believed in the Torah, right? They are called the Torah, the Nabavim, and the Ketuvim, right? Which is Torah, the prophets, and the books, right? That's collectively is what we sometimes erroneously call the Hebrew Bible. And I won't go into why we call it erroneously, right? But that's how it all comes together. So you see that when the word Samaritan shows up, there is a long history between the siblings. You see, they were not other people. They were siblings who ended up in a really bad situation. And through the years, because of distance and different cultural influences, they grew to be different people. And they refused, therefore, and it will make a lot of sense to you, therefore, Samaritans refused to turn to Jerusalem to pray to this day. Right? So that is a huge difference between them. Jews all turn to Jerusalem, to the temple, and Samaritans will look at a different mountain to pray. Right? Now, how does this all come together? That is what Jesus is doing. Jesus is taking this huge, long history of rivalry and saying that, my dear friend, is your neighbor. That is your neighbor. Now, what I really wanted to talk about is that as Christians, we are called to do what Jesus did, which is equally jarring as what Amos was doing. Right? That's why I love Amos so much. If there is one prophet I really love, that's Amos. Right? Because he tells it as it is. Right? And it is harsh. And just imagine if you knew all this story, that whole idea of Good Samaritan, oh, I want to be the Good Samaritan. Right? You probably will have different views about that Good Samaritan. Because you will see the intensity in that narrative. Right? Because what Jesus is doing is extremely jarring to this person who came with the question of, what must I do? What must I do? Now, my friends, to us, the question is, as the people who gather around the Lord's table, are we open to stand in the line of the prophets? Hence the first hymn. Are we open to stand in the line of the prophets? Because those prophets is who Jesus is preparing us to be when he says, be my disciple. Because sometimes, not sometimes, always, the word of God, which is the word of mercy and kindness, is very difficult to deliver because it goes against the grain of our tribal understanding of what is right and what is wrong. Amen?
Thank you for tuning in. Please like, comment, and subscribe.